Hey everybody, Robot here from Vespa Motorsport and ScooterWest.com. For all things Vespa, check us out on the web, ScooterWest.com. We have parts for both your vintage and modern Vespa. So if you've been following this multi-part series on resurrecting this beautiful brown 2013 GTV 300, we're pretty much ready to put the motor in. So the prior episodes, I overhauled the complete water pump assembly and thermostat housing. We've set the valve clearance, put a new spark plug in it, replaced a bunch of gaskets up there. And the most important thing why I removed the motor is I had to remove a broken stud from the exhaust. Had a very loud exhaust note before we took it out of service and pulled the motor in part one. So it's pretty much ready to go back in, but since I have the belt cover off, perfect opportunity to overhaul the transmission. I'm going to sell the scooter used through our Vespa shop, Vespa Motorsport here in San Diego. And the used bikes I like to sell, I want them fully serviced up with fresh tires. Usually we command a premium for our used scooters because we want to back them with a quality product. I want somebody to ride around a lot in San Diego and have something that isn't going to fall apart the moment they take delivery of it. So we already got the new Michelin City Grip rear tire, polished that chrome rim up. I had one of my texted, I said, oh my gosh, the rim looks brand new. The chrome rims are almost like a relic. The Seis Journeys, they haven't had chrome rims. The chrome rim disappeared in, I think, 2016. So transmission cover's all off. Took that off a while ago and turned the cover, obviously the engine oil's out of it. There's no coolant in there. But the best way to start with a fresh drivetrain is get the deluxe belt kit for your specific model. So this is a 300, pretty much all Vespa 300s from 2010 to 2019 use the same kit. Once you go to the newer HPEs, they have a different set of parts. We have those kits available as well, but if you just search the Scooter West web store for belt-GTS 300-DLX, you get the whole entire kit to overhaul the complete transmission, including the tools. So you got the holder tool for the front variator. You get the holder that will hold the clutch bell as well. So all the best OEM parts, rollers. I'm actually not showing all the parts that would normally be part of the kit. You can look at it on the web store, and you can look at the very detailed videos where I've overhauled the driven pulley assembly. This driven pulley is still in good shape, but it includes the gaskets, O-rings, and seals if you are going to overhaul this driven pulley. Does not include the clutch. Typically the clutch, when you pull this bell off, the clutch has a very long service life. I see people order them. Usually the only reason clutches fails because they either get noisy, like this back plate will wiggle a lot and it makes a racket noise. Sometimes the fan blades fail, or somebody just abuses the clutch, or it truly has a ton of miles and has worn out these shoes down to the last millimeter. So just looking at these shoes out, you need to get a dial gauge out. They have like about 3 millimeters of material on it. When they're new, they're 4 or 5 millimeters thick, so they're a little bit thicker, but still plenty of serviceable life in this clutch. And this scooter has 22,000 miles on it. I do know the belt was replaced at 18,000 miles on the scooter. The prior owner did do that. So I suspect the transmission parts are going to be in pretty good shape, but since we have it apart, perfect time at minimum to clean all these parts, because I can tell you when you clean the transmission, essentially the shifting, which isn't really shifting, but the transition from the low gear to the top gear is a little smoother, and the clutch will engage smoother when everything's cleaned out. Also, perfect opportunity to check some of the bearings. There's a couple bearings located throughout the transmission that are something that wears out over time. You have this idler roller. You check if there's free play in it or if there's damage to the pulley. Just rotates pretty good. It doesn't make too much noise. I don't see an issue with that, but it is available as a replacement spare part as a complete idler pulley. It's not necessarily, it looks like an idler pulley in a car, and that's why I've always called them that. And then you have this center support bearing. This is the most frequent bearing to fail in the transmission. Very inexpensive bearing. You'd heat up the case, pull that circlip out, and then knock the bearing out. This bearing Just spinning it, it's very smooth. It does not have excess free play in it. Very little noise in it, so no issues there. And then we'll pull the whole driven pulley off, and I'll show you some of the roller bearing and the needle bearings that you typically add a little bit of grease to. So let's get right to it. Let's get this transmission all apart. And I got the Variator holding tool that's included with the full deluxe belt transmission overhaul kit. You can also order these tools individually. We have all the tools available on the Scooter West web store. So essentially it comes with some spacers, a bolt, and this welded tool that splines with the 2 teeth that are on the thing. So it kind of mounts like that. We'll put the little spacer. They're all a little bit different. This one has a slightly different setup. You thread that in, and you can just do them hand tight. They do need to be tight, not wiggling around. Then some of them just have a longer bolt. I kind of modified this one a long time ago, so it's kind of not exactly like the one we sell. Should pull a brand new one off, but they all work pretty much the same. So at this point, just kind of line everything up and put this screw in. And now we'll get the 19mm socket on a pretty good size ratchet here. And oftentimes I like to hold that. And I'm gonna go on the other side, get a little bit better leverage on this. You know, you don't want to have the motor lift. Somebody put some Loctite on this. It's not really needed. I could tell there's Loctite on the threads. These have a domed washer that kind of puts tension on the bolt or the nut. And they've rarely ever had problems of ever backing off, like some of the earlier model Vespas and many other scooters. I've seen problems where these nuts sometimes back off if they're, I could smell the Loctite on there. Somebody put a ton of Loctite on it. The nut's actually warm. So at this point, we could take the tool off, you know, back off the tool here. And you have, this is why I don't like a ton of Loctite. It's into splines, it's on everything. You can see it flaking off. This is the one way, this washer only installs this direction. If the dome is kind of facing out, you can see it does not sit flat. That's not the correct way to reinstall it. So just FYI, obviously I'll install it correctly. You got the thicker flat washer that's right behind this pulley. And there's too much Loctite in the splines, so nothing wants to come apart. And if that's the case, you just kind of give it a wiggle and it will eventually all pop right off. So you got the flat washer, you got the fixed dry pulley, and just to kind of check it for wear, there is a specific measurement for it. You can put a straight edge across this and put a feeler gauge under it. Typically, if you got a worn pulley, I'm talking a scooter that has like probably over 40,000 miles, is when you may consider replacing a pulley. I'm running my finger across this. I don't really feel any dips. You could feel, you know, a slight edge where the belt doesn't ride, you know, on this very edge. But over this whole area where it's kind of polished from the belt, it's very smooth. I don't feel any divots or anything. So I would say this is still serviceable and good. Definitely a pretty inexpensive replaceable part. Then you got the thin washer. At this point, you could pull the whole driven pulley. I call this the driven pulley and the clutch assembly right off, and then get the belt right out of here too. So we'll measure that belt, see if it's reusable, and I'll show you everything about this shortly. So no, that's good. And the way I like to pull the Variator out is I usually take this boss and just, I hold the Variator so it doesn't pull the Variator out. And once you have the boss out, the idea here is I'm tipping the Variator kind of forward. The reason being is they tend to want to dump their contents as you pull them out. So if you do that carefully, you end up pulling this, the whole Variator out without it dumping the contents. These rollers do go in one direction. You see a solid side, then you see an open side. I always say the open clockwise. That's just the way they always are in all variators. If you have a style of variator roller that's not symmetrical on side to side, open side goes clockwise. It faces clockwise. So, and the last part that we're gonna look at is this ramp plate, and it's got a couple little slide bushings that I typically replace. Sometimes you end up with noise in the transmission. It's related to these wearing out. Very inexpensive. Pretty much just anytime you're in there, it's a good idea to replace them. Of course, the deluxe belt kit includes that. Perfect time to take a look at this oil seal here. It's very dry. You don't see anything. There's a little stain there, but I don't think it's not wet whatsoever in here. These seals are very robust. And they're also pretty difficult to change without the factory tool, an expensive seal, but they tend to last a very, very long time. I've taken apart motors that are very high miles, and this seal does not leak. It's a very good design. This seal is much more prone to leak. Very inexpensive. You could pry it out, clean the shaft, and then grease a new seal and tap it in there right over the shaft without dismantling the full final drive. This is full of gear oil. Not all the way full, but there's a small quantity of gear oil. And you can see the 3 bearing bosses in the case, and that's pretty much supporting 3 shafts. There's 3 sets of gear shafts. So you got the final drive, you have an intermediate shaft, and then the drive shaft for the reduction. So pretty much this shaft, when you're going at full speed on the highway, it's turning like nearly 20,000 RPMs. It's really, really high speed. And it's reduced quite a bit to your wheel speed. That's in the low 1,000 RPMs at highway speed. So the first thing I like to service on any automatic scooter transmission is typically the driven pulley. A lot of people don't know much about it. I have very detailed videos from the past on how to completely take this apart and overhaul it. It's completely rebuildable, which is pretty cool. They typically last a long time. Sometimes you'll see failure of the pulleys on very high mileage ones or the weaker designs. The GTS, 250s, 300s, they have a very robust, strong design with these aluminum pulleys. When the clutch is not engaged, it does ride on these bearings. You can see there's a ball bearing. It's very, very smooth right now, no problems there. And there's also a set of needle bearings right in here. And before I put it back in, I'll put a little bit of new grease in there. There is a little oil seal there. A little bit of grease sometimes will leak out. Definitely don't want to overpack this. Also, the grease lubricates a set of pins. And the way this works, it's pretty difficult to open up, is this is what tensions your belt. And I'm kind of rotating this. And there's pins that are greased that hold that. And if you watch my videos where I completely take this apart, you see how the whole mechanism works. So usually I'll service the clutch, just kind of scuff up the surfaces of the clutch. Doesn't need much, just a kind of routine belt service. You just do some basics like this. You don't need to necessarily overhaul the whole clutch. So I know the bearings feel good. The way if I broke the belt or had other problems, I would suspect problems with this and take it all the way apart. But I had a perfectly good belt. It was serviced about 4,000 miles ago. And this is very smooth, the action. There's no binding or anything. When those pins wear out, this thing will bind up, and that's what causes some belt slippage. And usually, if you have belt slippage, it's all related to this. The best way to clean any of these dry transmission components is just with brake parts cleaner. It's available at any auto parts store. And you want to capture the contents and dispose of it correctly. You could use some compressed air as well, but it blows dust everywhere. I find this cleaner works just fine. Obviously I have safety glasses on, and you can see kind of the dripping of the brake dust. There's pretty much clutch dust that builds up inside this assembly. And that's what causes some binding and rough engagement of the clutch, is when this stuff, the brake dust kind of builds up in the clutch assembly. And it dries on its own, but look at how dirty that solvent is that's coming off the the clutch. Don't need to go too crazy on it, but that's pretty much as far as I take it. You could pat it dry if you wanted to. Take a little small finger dab of grease. This is the Maxima grease, the waterproof, nice thick grease that works very well. This is available at the Scooter West web store. Just take a little finger of it, and you could just work that grease right into the needle bearing. And then I'd take maybe another little dab. It feels pretty dry, you know, midway down this this thing. You could just take another little dab of grease and go a little bit further and just wipe that in there, and that will grease those pins that this whole assembly twists on. So we'll set this aside and we'll move on to the Variator. So I'll go ahead and dump the weights out. Pretty much this assembly, it feels very smooth here. You take the boss, put it in there. There is a measurement for it. You should have just a tiny bit of rock in there. But the thing as part of the service is these start getting stiction to them. They kind of get like a gooey feel to them, and this bronze centered bushing kind of leaves some residue on this you know, ground steel pin. So we'll clean all those parts up. That's pretty critical to the smooth operation of the transmission. Another thing, if you're putting new belts on, the old belt, you probably don't necessarily need to do this, is just give it a swirl. This is like 120 or 80 grit sandpaper. Go all the way around the pulley and just give it a swirl. It kind of breaks that glaze that's on this aluminum pulley, so the new belt will seat a little quicker, it won't slip. And you can do the same with the fixed half pulley. This is the outer pulley on the Variator. And pretty much that's all you got to do this. You can also clean it a little bit, only a small amount of spray. Take a clean rag and wipe it free if you want to. The spray will just evaporate on its own. The important part is there's a lot of residue from the plastic and the clutch that builds up inside this Variator, so it's pretty important to clean that all out. And this spray happens to work the best. There's other ways to clean it. Here in a professional workshop, we actually have a parts cleaner, so it's a little more resourceful than using a one-time use can. You know, for cleaning, it also captures all the solvent that comes off it, so it's a little better for the environment than collecting this dirt here. So you clean that out, and I typically like these like green shop towel things. Put some of that solvent on there, and the boss, you can just wipe it clean. It almost looks like chrome once you clean it off. And you can see that residue coming off, and same with this bronze centered bushing in here. At this point, that thing it has no stiction whatsoever. It's very, very smooth. Next thing we're gonna do is go ahead, this thing is pretty clean right here. You put new drive guides on here, the guide pins. And they slide on that way. You can see they look like that. And before I even put roller weights in there, this is something I want to check. So you want to have a little free play on this. You know, it barely moves side to side, that's perfect. If these guides are worn out, you'll get a lot of chatter and abnormal operation of the Variator. And you just want nice smooth operation, especially with the factory parts. It all fits really nice. No problems there, so we know we're all good. If I put these ones on, they're probably a little looser on the pins, because these plastic parts are actually the bearing surface for that, these three sliding guides right here. The Variator rollers, there is a specified diameter of them. You could measure them, but these look very uniform and round and still in really good serviceable condition. You can clean them. You want to look for flat spots. My thoughts on the roller weights is the OEM ones happen to just last the longest. They last longer than the Dr. Pulley sliders, any of those ones. The performance ones from like Melosi, Pulley, you know, they're more or less like kind of for a race application. They tend to last not as long. They're just a softer material and wear out quicker. And Piaggio's recommendation is replacing these every 10,000 kilometers, every 6,000 miles. If you're going to take your transmission part on your own, you may be able to get away with replacing them, letting that service life go a little longer. But I feel no flat spots whatsoever on these. They're sometimes pretty much always sold as six sets. These have plenty of service life on them. Look at the ends, the metal's not coming loose. I think they're in pretty good shape. They probably were changed only 4,000 miles ago based on the miles when the belt was serviced. So we're going to go ahead and put these back in. But you know, as for the sake of doing service in the workshop, sometimes I would just change them anyways, because you want to give a full service life of these. So sometimes it's just better off starting with new ones. So go ahead and drop them all in, and if you notice the direction, open clockwise. Closed side is going counterclockwise, so you make sure they're all in the same direction. Very important. If you put them in the wrong direction, it just end up tearing up the variator in short order. So you put that all back together. This guide, I mean, it can go in either way. Sometimes I look at it, it's got a little bit more rust on the one side. You know, it doesn't really matter. Symmetrical, as long as it's not score or problems with it, I think it's all good to go. And every time you move this around, you got to kind of hold it just like that, because it will fall all apart. Or if I let the back half, the ramp plate drop, and then all my rollers will fall right out. So let me quickly talk about anatomy of the drive belts found in these CVT automatic scooters. Many of the belts are designated to install a certain direction. It's based on the Kevlar and fiberglass banding and how they laminate them and put them together. So these little things right here are arrows that point the direction that the belt turns. You can see the several layers of the belt. The teeth are just there for cooling, more or less, and also the flexibility of the belt. You can see this very light area. That's the Kevlar bands in the belt. The belts are very specific. Pretty much the length of the belt, the angle of this ramp. There's various angles, the inside diameter, and also the construction. You know, some of them have a smooth outside, some have a tooth outside. My recommendation is, if you want the longest life and the least problems, go with an OEM belt. There's other high quality manufacturers such as Melosi and Gates that also make pretty decent belts. But sometimes even the nice name brand aftermarket belts, they just don't quite give the full service life like an OEM belt. Piaggio specifies on the 2010 to 2019 GTS, they replace the drive belt every 9,000 miles, which is about, I think, 15,000 kilometers. It's a little bit short. You could stretch it to about 20,000 kilometers or 12,000 miles. If you ride the scooter easy. If you're on the highway all the time, change this at 9,000 miles. It will strand you when it breaks. It's not a fun thing. You're gonna do a cross-country trip, start with a brand new belt. That's my advice for you. So I'll show you some telltales on checking out an old belt. I already know that this belt has about 4,000 miles, so it's about half its life. Those rollers, I think, still have at least another 6,000 miles of no problem. You should be going back in the transmission 6,000 miles anyways. But they pretty much have a measurement, and you also inspect them. When they're overheated, you'll see a lot of cracks on the inside. This thing looks really good still. But we're gonna do a basic measurement on both belts. So I have a zeroed out caliper here. And you want to take the caliper, open it, and you're going to measure on the very widest part. So I'm using like kind of thicker part of the caliper. So we're at 21.0, 21.05. You do it in several parts. 21.11. You know, so everywhere I measure it, we're right there at 21. So start with a new one. 21.30, and you know, it's going to be pretty consistent. 21.40. So I've lost probably 0.2 of a millimeter on this belt. The service limit, if you just need to replace it, If it's under 21, I would just automatically replace this belt. It's pretty much at its half-life right now. You know, the scooter being at 22,000 miles and it was changed at 18,000 miles. So this belt, you know, the service life on it at 27,000 miles is when we should be going back into this transmission and replacing this belt, based on it being replaced at the standard 18,000 mile service. So this is the second belt that's been in this motor over all the years. Still has some service life on it, and we'll go ahead and put this back in. And sometimes it's kind of hard to see the arrows, but you can still see them. Clean the belt off, we'll be able to put that right back in. So the last part of the transmission is the clutch bell, and it builds up a lot of dust in there, and that also causes some chatter of the clutch. So usually I clean out with a rag, and I'll go in there with some sandpaper and just scuff the surface up. You don't need to go too much, just break the glaze, break the additional dirt out of it, and the clutch will engage so much smoother. You know, it will kind of, until it builds up more dust. So pretty much every time you service the transmission, you should be going in there and cleaning all these parts out. Kind of same thing. Take the clean part of the rag, wipe it out, and now there's a nice new slightly roughed up surface for the clutch. So before I reinstall the transmission, it's best to get the belt engaged in the driven pulley before we install it. So you have the arrow pointing this direction, like clockwise, and we're going to go ahead and work this pulley up and see how I got that in there. It's pretty far in there. You can do it with or without the clutch bell on there. And then we're going to go ahead and move right over to the transmission. So I have these two parts ready to go. I'm holding this variator so it doesn't fall apart, and I'm holding the belt and the driven pulley so the belt does not pull out of the groove of the pulley here. So you take this pulley, and I'm kind of holding it. You can see my back fingers there. Just do it nice and efficient so you're not fighting with it and having it fall apart. And at this point, just push the whole entire pulley on, and nothing fell apart, nothing came all apart there. And next, we'll go ahead and, still holding that belt right into the V groove there, go ahead and slide that right onto that shaft there. And see how there's a nice space right there? That's very important. Otherwise, you end up tightening the pulley right up against the belt, and that's a bad thing. Go ahead and put that one thin, kind of larger diameter washer on. We got the fixed pulley. Go ahead and engage that onto the splines there. And you can kind of see the belt just floating around here. This thing is touching the metal washer. That's the way it should be. A little bit thinner washer, and then the dome washer. And you know it's the right direction when it's sitting nice and flat. You don't see a gap. And you can take the nut, start threading that. Still, I got some Loctite. So a little bit of friction on there. And you can just start by tightening the thing with just a regular ratchet. Obviously with a little bit of friction, it's kind of turning against the And next we're going to get a torque wrench out and set it to about 60 foot-pounds. And we'll put the tool back on just like when we remove the pulley, get everything lined up. So this is one of the most critical torques for the whole entire engine. If you blow it on this or don't torque this where this is, you tighten against the belt, and this comes loose, it ends up destroying your crankshaft. And that's a very costly repair. I've seen it from amateurs doing their own belt jobs sometimes. I've seen professionals blow it. So 60 foot-pounds. There we go. Now we can pull the tool out. And the opposite of under tightening it or tightening up against the belt is if you over tighten it, it can actually break the crankshaft. All right, pretty important, put the clutch belt on. If you don't put that on, your clutch will be completely destroyed the moment you start your motor. So before we put the belt cover on, we're gonna go ahead and check the belt cover air filter. So there's a pair of screws that hold this little plastic cover on the 300. It's pretty similar on many other models as well. They all typically have a little filter. And look at that thing. Look at all that cat hair in there. You blow it out with compressed air. You could use a little brush to brush it out. This filter, you can kind of wipe all that lint and stuff off of it. It's a little fragile. If it's falling apart, it'd be a good idea to replace this element. Available on the Scooter West web store. You can clean it out with that same solvent. It's not typically going to deteriorate the filter and get all the dust out of it. So we'll go ahead and clean that out with some solvent, or you can do soapy water, and we'll pop it back in place before we put the belt cover back on. All right, so I was thinking about cleaning it, and it's looking a little thin. Yeah, that thing's done. You gotta remember, this is a nearly 10-year-old foam, so it's got a limited lifetime, not worth salvaging or cleaning, but a pretty important part to keep the drivetrain nice and clean. So 842093 is just a whole brand new filter. And unlike the air filter for the engine, you just install this dry. So you just pretty much drop that right into the little filter cavity. And then we put the cover back on. And I tend to like to do this because if you take it apart with the dipstick out, it tends to want to drop debris right into your oil pan. The way these plastic screws, sometimes you'll back them up and then start turning them so they do not cut new threads because they kind of have a limited lifespan as well. So I have the oil fill plug hole, pull the little plug that I had in there. Bell's all on, we know everything's good. This bearing feels great. It's so easy to do the transmission when the motor's out of the bike. So it definitely makes the job a little easier. A couple things we do have. We have this little hose that goes on that bolt. We have the ground wire that will also go to the frame when we reinstall the motor. Normally it'd be coming down. That will go on this hole right here. We have this small flat washer that goes onto the shaft right here. And the nut will just get it started. And then we have the remaining 8 bolts that will go back into the belt cover. Some of them we're not going to tighten all the way because when we reinstall the motor, we have the brake caliper. So just going to get them all started. And it's best to do it by hand or with a hand tool. Don't want to go to town with an impact. Kind of get them all started. I'm going to put this one in, but we're not going to tighten this one, but there is a little bracket also for the hose. Again, with this one, not going to tighten that one all the way. And the last one. Just go ahead and get them all tightened, and I go back and forth to kind of put even pressure on all these bolts. And if you want to torque them with a torque wrench, about 7.5 foot-pounds, just a twist of the wrist if you're doing it with a T-handle like this or a small ratchet. And those last two I'm going to leave alone. So go ahead and just tighten the nut hand tight. Go ahead and put a locking tool in here. You may have to move the wheel a little bit to get it to lock in place. Part number, Scooter West part number, tool ETC-IA. Set your torque wrench to 45 foot-pounds with the 19mm socket. And we'll just set it, torque it right to 45 foot-pounds, and there we go. That's all it needs. And you could pop the little cover on. And one last thing that we'll put on before the getting the engine back in there. It's easy to do while it's out, the motor's out. This is your rear fender. Went ahead and cleaned that part off. And it kind of sets in place. And I have the single screw with the little washer, and that goes on from the other side. This side is all retained by the same fasteners that hold the air box. So there you go, there's a simplified video of kind of what I'd be doing if I needed to check out the belt drive on a Vespa scooter, or pretty much any automatic scooter. They're all pretty much the same. Not much difference between them. Some have some different clutch arrangements. Something that's drastically different would be something like a Bergman 650 that's got a metal belt, very much like an automatic transmission in a car, a CVT automatic transmission in a car. But pretty much all the automatic scooters use a very similar arrangement. Ever since the early 80s, they've kind of been using this style of a transmission. Look out for the next video. We're going to shove the motor right in, and I'm going to hook everything up and refill the fluids, and we'll have the scooter running by the next video. Thanks for watching. It's Robot here from Vespa Motorsport and ScooterWest.com. If you stumble across this video, you might check out all my other videos. Just type Vespa Motorsport into YouTube search, and in the search from the Vespa Motorsport channel, you can pretty much search any subject how-to video for a Vespa scooter, and I probably have covered it over all the years. Thanks to all my subscribers. We're over 100,000 subscribers to the Vespa Motorsport channel. Thanks again. I like all the support. I like all the comments. I wish I had more time to reply to them, but I'm busy running a shop here. See you on the next one. Robot here.